Hello, my friend. Hi, guys. Good evening to you. Or perhaps it is already the quiet stillness of night where you are. Maybe you are lying down, the blanket pulled gently over your shoulders, your breathing slowing as you search for rest. Perhaps you came here because the day pressed upon you too heavily, and you needed something steady, something calm, a voice that carries you into a different world. Or maybe you simply wanted to drift into history, because the past has its own strange rhythm, a rhythm that can rock you slowly towards sleep. Whatever brought you here, welcome. Tonight, we will wander together into the world of a man who believed himself to be the very sun itself, King Louis XIV of France. But not through his wars or his palaces alone, not through his great declarations of absolute monarchy, but through something softer, more curious, and somehow more intimate. The things he ate, the indulgences he could not resist, the junk food of his time, and what that meant for him, for his people, and even for us, looking back from the comfort of our modern world. Let me ask you something before we begin. Have you ever considered how much of our daily life, the small habits that we hardly think about, might someday be seen as extraordinary curiosities? The soda cans in our hands, the drive-through hamburgers, the greasy paper bags and sweet wrappers. What if centuries from now, these objects become windows into our souls, judged by people who have never tasted them, who find them shocking, laughable, or strangely revealing? What if a future historian whispers to their audience, late at night, about the way you enjoyed potato chips in the glow of your television, the way you bit into candy when the world felt uncertain? That, my friend, is exactly what we are about to do for Louis XIV. Because Louis, the Sun King, the man who turned France into a stage where he alone held the spotlight, was not immune to the cravings of his time. Beneath the heavy wigs and the stiff brocades, beneath the painted ceilings of Versailles and the ceremonies designed to remind everyone of his power, he was still a human being, vulnerable to hunger, to temptation, to the small seductions of taste. And in the 17th century, what we would call junk food was already there: sugared almonds that cracked between the teeth, candied fruit, sticky and glistening under candlelight, mountains of buttery pastries puffing up from ovens that never cooled, wine poured endlessly until the senses blurred. Tonight, we will not rush. You will not hear a list rattled off like a lecture. Instead, imagine yourself there. Imagine the slow turn of time, the flicker of torches against gilded walls, the smell of roasted meats thick in the air, the faint sweetness of marzipan drifting from the tables. Imagine the king, surrounded by courtiers who worshipped him like planets around the sun, reaching again and again for indulgences that were both pleasure and poison. And as you imagine, let the rhythm of these images settle you. Let them wash over you until they carry you gently toward that place between wakefulness and sleep. Do you ever wonder what it felt like to live in a world where food was not simply sustenance, but performance? Louis XIV understood this better than anyone. Every meal he ate was theater. The clatter of silver, the carefully arranged dishes, the court that watched him chew as if it were a kind of ritual, all of it was designed to say, here is power. But within that theater lay the hidden reality of indulgence, of overconsumption, of what we might recognize as junk food. Excessive sugar, excessive fat, flavors designed not for health, but for the brief and dizzying pleasure of the tongue. And like us, Louis paid the price. His teeth decayed, his body ached, his health faltered beneath the weight of constant excess. Yet still, he ate. Perhaps you have felt something similar. Perhaps you know the strange comfort of food that is not good for you but soothes something invisible inside you. A slice of cake at midnight, a soda that sparkles against your tongue even when your stomach resents it. Louis, too, sought that comfort. His world was wrapped in velvet and power, but inside he carried the same restless cravings that we carry now. And it is in those cravings that we meet him most honestly, not as a king untouchable, but as a man who could not say no to sweetness, who built a kingdom of grandeur even as his own body betrayed him. So, settle in. Let your breath slow. Imagine the long galleries of Versailles stretching out, the mirrored walls catching candlelight, the distant echo of footsteps across marble. Imagine being there, unnoticed, a shadow moving gently through the halls. You are not a courtier forced to bow, nor a servant running with a tray. You are simply an observer, slipping silently into the king's private world, watching as he leans toward another sugared delicacy, watching as he laughs, as the courtiers smile too widely, as the crumbs fall unseen to the floor. This is where we will stay for a while. In this strange intimacy of food and power, of indulgence and decay. The junk food of Louis XIV is not the junk food of your corner store, yet it is born from the same impulse, a desire for pleasure, a rebellion against moderation, a hunger that is never fully satisfied. Sweetness was rare once, exotic, expensive, and Louis claimed it all, filling his tables with mountains of sugar sculpted into swans, fruits glazed until they gleamed like jewels. Salt, too, was poured liberally, meat roasted until the fat dripped, sauces thick enough to weigh down even the lightest bread. Wine flowed, stronger than you would dare drink before sleep. Each glass a dulling of the senses, a slide into indulgent haze. As you listen, notice the rhythm. Notice how the story slows, how each detail lingers just long enough to settle before giving way to the next. This is not a tale of speed or excitement. It is a lullaby disguised as history, one that will lead you deeper into the night. And if your eyes begin to close, that is all right. Let them close. The king will still be here, feasting, his world still spinning, his courtiers still pretending not to notice his teeth rotting in his smile. You may leave him for sleep, and when you return tomorrow, he will still be waiting. But for now, stay with me just a little longer. Think of the strange contrast. A man who claimed to be eternal, who demanded that his image never fade, undone by the same sugar that calls to us from supermarket shelves. Think of the echo across centuries, from candied chestnuts at Versailles to candy bars unwrapped beneath neon lights. Different worlds, same cravings. And it is in those cravings, my friend, that we will find the true story, not of battles won or treaties signed, but of what it means to be human, fragile, and always reaching for one more bite. And so, our journey begins. You might imagine, my friend, that to understand the beginning of Louis XIV's relationship with food, with indulgence, and with what we might call junk food, we should begin in the kitchens of Versailles. But truly, it begins earlier, long before the mirrors and gardens, before the Sun King was even the Sunday. It begins in the vulnerable quiet of childhood, in a palace that was not yet transformed, in a boy who was taught that every mouthful carried not only taste but meaning. Louis was born into hunger, disguised as ceremony. France, in the middle of the 17th century, was a land of contrasts, so sharp they might cut the skin. Famine clawed at the poor in the countryside, while the nobility at court buried themselves beneath sugar and salt as if trying to prove that they were immune to want. The boy who would become the king absorbed this rhythm early, the sight of nobles tearing at sweetmeats with sticky fingers, the smell of roasted birds heavy with butter, the knowledge that in his world, abundance was not simply pleasure, but power. And as he grew, he would cling to that power in every bite, as if the act of eating itself confirmed his right to rule. Imagine him as a child, sitting at a long table where food became a spectacle. Servants in livery carried dishes in slow procession, not to feed hunger alone, but to display wealth. Platters gleamed with candied fruits, sugar sculpted into flowers that would never wilt, pies so dense with meat and spice they seemed impossible to finish. Louis's small hand would reach toward them, the courtiers watching with indulgent smiles, for even then the boy was the embodiment of France's future. And when he tasted, when the sugar melted on his tongue, he learned something that would never leave him. Food was a stage, and he was always at the center of it. Do you know what sugar meant in his time? It was not the commonplace sweetener that fills your shelves today, not the spoonful you stir absent-mindedly into coffee, not the candy bar you pick up without thought. Sugar was exotic, expensive, precious. To serve it in abundance was to proclaim dominance, to whisper to the world that you could bend distant colonies and faraway merchants to your desires. For Louis, sugar was not just flavor, it was sovereignty distilled. And so from his earliest years, his tongue was coated not just with sweetness, but with the idea that sweetness was power, that to indulge was to affirm his place above others. As he grew into adolescence, this indulgence deepened. His body, still slender, was trained for dance, for the ritual of courtly performance. He was a boy who would become a man who made every step, every gesture, an act of theater. And food followed him into this performance. To eat was not to quiet hunger but to display mastery. At banquets, he sat beneath candlelight that threw golden halos around his curls, courtiers watching as he chewed with deliberate grace, each swallow a signal that he was nourished, not just by meat and bread, but by the very act of being observed. The courtiers, of course, mirrored him, reaching for their own sugared almonds, their own candied chestnuts, their own glasses of thickened wine, yet none of them could match him, for only he could command the endless supply, only he could claim that every morsel was placed there for him. You might wonder, why call this junk food? Because though it was wrapped in ceremony, though it glittered beneath chandeliers, it carried the same weight of overindulgence, of excess without nourishment. Imagine candied fruits glossy, sticky, transformed from natural harvest into unnatural jewels. Imagine pastries so laden with butter that they dissolved into grease against the lips. Imagine sauces thickened not to highlight flavor but to smother it, to drown the tongue in heaviness. These foods were not made to sustain the body. They were made to dazzle, to overwhelm, to offer the fleeting pleasure of excess. And Louis, even as his teeth began to rot, even as his stomach rebelled, reached for them again and again, because to deny them would have been to deny himself. Picture the young king in his early reign, when France was still recovering from the chaos of civil war, when he decided that he would no longer be ruled by ministers, that he would rule alone. He chose to make Versailles the heart of his universe, to transform it from a hunting lodge into the very axis of monarchy. And with that transformation came the kitchens, sprawling, hot, chaotic, alive with smoke and steam. The kitchens of Versailles were worlds unto themselves, vast caverns where hundreds of servants labored, sweating before hearths that burned without rest, turning spits heavy with venison, baking loaves that would feed not only the court but the image of the king. In these kitchens, sugar was melted and spun, fruits preserved until their sweetness could last for months, meats roasted and drenched in sauces until their flavors were nearly unrecognizable. And always, always, the dishes returned to Louis. For his table was the stage upon which this entire labor played out. Think of the rhythm of those meals. Morning would arrive with bread and chocolate. Yes, chocolate. Still rare, still costly, poured as a bitter drink, thickened with sugar until it slid across the tongue in decadent waves. Midday brought meats upon meats, sauces that gleamed with fat, pies filled to bursting. Evening descended with a banquet. A slow parade of dishes meant less for consumption than for spectacle, and yet Louis consumed. He reached for the candied chestnuts, he dipped bread into sauces, he drank wine until the world grew hazy. Courtiers followed, but none could outdo him, for none could outshine the Sunday, and as he ate, as he indulged, his body began to betray him. His teeth, once white, blackened and broke. His stomach ached, his bowels rebelled, his body swelled, and yet he pressed on, because food was not only sustenance, it was identity, it was proof, it was theater. To eat less would have been to appear weak. To refuse sweetness would have been to appear ungenerous. And so he ate, and France watched, and the kitchens labored, and the excess became the rhythm of Versailles. You might ask yourself now, lying in the quiet of your room, what it would feel like to live in such a world. Imagine the constant sweetness clinging to your tongue, the heaviness of butter weighing upon your stomach, the endless expectation that you must perform even in the act of chewing. Imagine knowing that every bite you take is being watched, judged, recorded in whispers. Would you find comfort in the indulgence, or would you grow weary, longing for a simple piece of fruit, a plain loaf of bread, something honest and unadorned? Louis rarely allowed himself that honesty. For him, food was never private. It was always a spectacle, always a declaration, always a crown placed upon his head in edible form. And so, as we move deeper into his story, hold this image close. The boy who learned that sugar was power, the adolescent who discovered that eating was performance, the king who transformed indulgence into identity. Because everything that follows the banquets, the spectacles, the decay, flows from this beginning. It is the quiet truth beneath the glitter, that even the Sun King could not escape the pull of cravings, that even the most powerful man in Europe was undone not by armies or conspiracies, but by the small and stubborn hunger that whispered to him in every sweet bite. If you close your eyes now and imagine Versailles not as the shimmering monument it appears today, but as it was when Louis XIV breathed within its walls, you will sense that food there was never just food, it was the architecture of his universe. The palace itself pulsed like a great body, and the kitchens were its stomach, restless, overheated, forever digesting and producing, churning out endless meals that mirrored the endless need for display. Imagine the sprawling maze beneath the ground, fires lit before dawn, servants rushing with baskets of poultry, slabs of beef, sugar molded into shapes that seemed more like sculpture than nourishment, ovens sighing as loaves and pastries emerged in clouds of sweet steam. This was not simply a place to prepare meals, it was a factory of symbolism, a stage hidden beneath the stage, where junk food was not the guilty pleasure of the few but the gilded mask of an entire monarchy. When Louis chose Versailles as his stage, he knew instinctively that power had to be visible in every detail, and food was one of the most visible. The banquets were ceremonies, choreographed down to the clatter of plates, rehearsed not for their efficiency but for the rhythm of awe they produced. Courtiers were summoned to witness the king's meals, as though eating itself was a liturgy, and they stood, sometimes for hours, simply to watch him take a bite. The moment a spoon touched his lips was the moment France affirmed its center, and yet beneath the solemnity lay an undercurrent of absurdity. The king was devouring candied fruits and buttery tarts, heavy sauces dripping onto bread, food designed for excess rather than sustenance, while the poor beyond the palace walls scraped at crusts and searched fields for scraps. Junk food at Versailles was not a private vice. It was a public declaration that indulgence itself was divine right. Do you hear the faint echo, even in your own life, of how food is used to show rather than to nourish? The glossy advertisements that make burgers shine with artificial grease, the towers of sugar in supermarket aisles, the soda cups too large for the hand. These are not so far from Versailles. Louis's banquets were the 17th century version of the same seduction, a promise of abundance, a glittering illusion that hides the cost. And just as today the price is paid in bodies weary with excess, then too it was paid in the quiet agony of decay. Picture the grand hall of mirrors. By day, sunlight cascaded across glass that reflected endlessly, multiplying the image of the king until he seemed infinite. By night, the chandeliers glowed, the air thick with candle smoke, the tables set with dishes that seemed almost unreal. Whole pheasants glazed until their skins gleamed, fish soaked in spices imported at great cost, towers of pastries collapsing under their own sweetness. Courtiers leaned in, smiling too widely, laughing at nothing, desperate to be near the glow. They dipped fingers into sauces, chewed sugared almonds until their teeth ached, swallowed wine until their eyes blurred. Junk food was contagious here. The king's cravings became their cravings, and soon all of Versailles was trapped in a rhythm of excess, not because they hungered, but because hunger was the only way to mirror the Sunday. In this glittering fever, even the architecture of Versailles bent itself toward indulgence. Hidden corridors allowed dishes to arrive in sequence, servants moving like shadows, unseen but always present, carrying trays piled high with candied chestnuts, marzipan fruits, steaming soups too salted to finish, meat pies so dense they seemed sculpted from stone. The palace smelled constantly of roasting, frying, sugaring, baking. Imagine walking those halls and never breathing fresh air untouched by food, the sweetness of sugar clinging to your nostrils, the smoke of roasting birds catching in your throat. The palace itself was addicted, unable to exhale anything but indulgence. Louis understood that to be king was to consume. He performed it daily, each meal a reminder that his body was the body of France. And yet his own body began to crumble under the strain. His teeth blackened and fell. His stomach rebelled with constant illness. His joints stiffened. His breath grew heavy. Still he ate. Still he drank. Still he reached for more sugared fruits, because to stop was to admit weakness, and weakness was not allowed. The junk food of Versailles was therefore both crown and curse. It crowned him with the glitter of abundance, but cursed him with a slow, humiliating decay. Consider now how the courtiers imitated him. They were trapped, too. To refuse the sweets he favored, to step back from the plates he touched, was to risk appearing less devoted, less loyal. And so they reached for more and more, their stomachs groaning, their teeth aching, their health failing, but always with a smile, always pretending that sweetness was pleasure, not poison. The court became a mirror of its king, a hall of reflections where indulgence echoed endlessly, no one daring to break the pattern. And outside, the peasants starved. They watched wagons roll past carrying sugar, spices, fruits, all destined for Versailles, while their own tables remained bare. Junk food at court was built upon hunger in the fields, sweetness paid for with bitterness, and yet within the palace walls, this reality was blurred. The courtiers, drunk on sugar and wine, whispered endlessly about each dish, each morsel the king chose. Gossip spread not about battles or treaties, but about whether the king had favored candied chestnuts over sugared almonds, whether he had lingered too long on roasted venison, whether he had raised his glass for wine or for chocolate. These small indulgences became symbols, read like omens, weighed like prophecies. Junk food was no longer food at all, it was language, politics, a code through which courtiers tried to guess the shifting winds of power. Do you feel the quiet absurdity of it? A king, worshipped for chewing, courtiers trembling over sweets, a palace suffocating under sugar, while beyond its gates, famine carved itself into faces. Yet this absurdity is not unfamiliar. Think of the headlines today. Endless articles about the favorite fast food of celebrities, the Instagram posts of meals, staged not for taste, but for image. We, too, live in a world where indulgence is spectacle, where junk food becomes status. Versailles, in its golden haze, was simply the loudest version of this truth. Imagine the servants who carried these dishes, their hands blistered from the heat, their backs bent beneath trays, their eyes stinging with smoke. They did not taste the sugared fruits they carried. They did not sip the wines that sloshed in heavy goblets. They inhaled the sweetness but never swallowed it. For them, Versailles was not indulgence but exhaustion, endless labor to maintain an illusion they could never share. And yet they, too, became part of the spectacle, invisible but essential, the hidden machinery of junk food excess. The kitchens themselves were dangerous worlds. Fires burned constantly, knives flashed, cauldrons boiled, the air thick with grease and smoke. Rats skittered in the shadows, drawn by the endless scraps, and servants swatted them away as if they were just another part of the rhythm. Food spoiled quickly in the heat, but sugar and salt masked decay, so meat that might have soured was drowned in heavy sauces, sweetness hiding rot. Junk food was sometimes not only indulgence but disguise, a way to turn what was nearly inedible into something the king might accept. And in this disguise lay another truth, that even in his glittering abundance, Louis was eating shadows, tasting illusions. As the years passed, Versailles became addicted to this rhythm. Banquets grew longer, the parades of dishes more elaborate, the sugar sculptures taller, the pastries more ornate. It was never enough. Excess demanded more excess. Indulgence demanded louder indulgence, until the palace seemed to drown in its own sweetness. And through it all, Louis sat at the center, the sun that never set, his body weakening but his performance unwavering. Junk food had become ritual, ritual had become identity, and identity had become destiny. And so, as you lie there now, listening in the quiet, imagine yourself slipping through those mirrored halls, the chandeliers flickering, the tables groaning beneath their weight. Imagine watching the king lift a sugared chestnut to his lips, his courtiers laughing too loudly, the servants sweating in silence. Imagine the sweetness that never ends, sweetness that hides decay, sweetness that becomes both crown and curse. That was Versailles. That was Louis. That was junk food transformed into history. If the first taste of power for Louis XIV came through sugar and spectacle, then the bitterness that followed came through his body's slow betrayal. To imagine him only as the radiant Sun King, forever shining from Versailles, is to miss the shadow that clung to him, the aching truth that even a man who sat higher than all others could not command his own flesh. His body, weighed down by indulgence, became a battlefield where junk food, medicine, and superstition clashed endlessly. And as the courtiers whispered in candlelit corridors, as the doctors crowded his chambers, As the king himself clenched his jaw against pain, a new drama unfolded. The story of how a man who consumed everything around him found himself consumed in return. The teeth were the first to give way. Years of sugared almonds, candied chestnuts, marzipan fruits, thickened chocolate, and wine so sweet they clung to the tongue left their mark. His mouth, once a weapon of charm and command, darkened with decay. By middle age, Louis suffered unbearable pain, abscesses swelling until his jaw throbbed, his breath fouling the air despite the perfumes he drowned himself in. Courtiers pretended not to notice, yet they noticed everything. When he smiled, they saw gaps where teeth had been wrenched out with crude instruments. When he winced, they whispered that perhaps the sun was dimming. Junk food had left him scarred, not visibly at first, but in ways impossible to hide once the rot took root. Imagine the scene: a royal chamber, rich with tapestries, heavy with incense, meant to disguise the odor of infection. The king reclines in his chair, a surgeon approaching with iron tools gleaming in the flicker of candlelight. No anesthesia, no relief, but prayer. They grasp, they pull, they tear. Blood spills, and the Sun King clenches his fists, refusing to scream. One tooth after another gone, until by his later years he could barely chew. His meals, once mountains of roasted meat and layered pastries, became softer, soups and broths, thickened with the same sugar that had ruined him. Still he ate, because indulgence was not simply habit, it was identity. And so the cycle continued. Sweetness leading to decay, decay leading to softer sweetness, indulgence feeding upon itself like a snake devouring its own tail. But the teeth were only the beginning. His stomach, too, rebelled against the endless tide of excess. Historians tell of his chronic constipation, his bloated belly, the pain that left him pacing his chambers at night. Physicians were summoned, their remedies strange mixtures of superstition and half-knowledge. They bled him, drained his body of what little strength remained. They dosed him with laxatives made of herbs, oils, even ground pearls. They prescribed enemas so frequently that the king submitted to them hundreds upon hundreds of times in his lifetime. A humiliating ritual cloaked in the dignity of medical necessity. Imagine the Sun King, the most powerful man in Europe, bent beneath the strange instruments of his doctors. The court pretending that this, too, was majesty. Junk food had unsettled his body, and medicine of the time had no cure but spectacle dressed as science. And then there were the more grotesque afflictions, the ones whispered with unease: his gout, his swollen joints, the aching of limbs made heavy by years of indulgence, the ulcers that erupted upon his skin, festering, oozing, barely contained by bandages. In his final decades, a particularly cruel illness appeared, a fistula near his anus, a wound that would not heal, a source of agony that court physicians prodded and studied as if the very fate of France depended on it. And in a way, it did. For if the king faltered, so too did the image of France as eternal, radiant, unbreakable. Surgeries were performed, knives cutting where no king should be cut, and yet Louis endured, refusing to let his court see weakness. The same man who devoured sugared fruits before their eyes now endured their stares as he limped, as he clenched his jaw against waves of pain. But here is the strange part. Even as his body betrayed him, the ritual of indulgence never stopped. Banquets continued, dishes piled high, sugar sculptures rising taller, wine flowing without pause. Louis sat at the head of the table, sometimes unable to chew, sometimes sipping only broth, sometimes grimacing as pain surged through his jaw or his belly. And still, the spectacle carried on, because it was not about what he ate, but that he ate. Junk food at Versailles had become more than pleasure. It had become a mask, a veil to hide decay, a performance to assure France that its sun had not dimmed. You might think of this now, in your own quiet room, as a reminder of how the body resists illusions. You can dress decay in silk, you can perfume infection, you can sculpt sugar into swans, but the body knows. It whispers its rebellion through pain, through abscess, through swelling, and Louis, for all his power, was no different than you, than me. The junk food he adored became the seeds of his undoing. The doctors who surrounded him more showmen than healers, the court more audience than support. Imagine the whispers in those halls. A servant carrying a tray of candied fruits hears the courtiers discussing the king's breath, foul with rot. A physician emerges from surgery, blood upon his hands, and is met with nervous questions. Will the king live? Will the sun continue to rise? At Versailles, even the junk food became a code for reading the king's health. If he reached for sugared almonds, perhaps he was recovering. If he declined, perhaps death was near. Food, which had once been spectacle of power, became a spectacle of survival, a fragile barometer of life itself. And yet, through all this, Louis remained committed to his role. He danced less, he walked slower, but he never abandoned the ceremony of indulgence. There is something almost tragic in it. A man devoured by the very symbols he created. A body undone by the sweets that were meant to confirm his divinity. And still he endured, perhaps because endurance itself was his greatest performance. The junk food of Louis XIV was not simply the sugar on his table. It was the illusion that excess could be eternal, that power could be eaten and swallowed and digested without consequence. But the consequence was written upon his body, in every missing tooth, every wound, every groan in the night. So, as you drift further into the rhythm of this story, let yourself see both sides of the Sun King, the glittering monarch presiding over banquets that dazzled the court, and the broken man pacing his chambers in agony, clutching his stomach, his jaw throbbing, his body betraying him. This is the truth that lies beneath Versailles, the quiet truth that junk food always carries. Pleasure at first bite, decay in the long run. And Louis XIV, for all his majesty, was no exception. There is a curious thing about power, my friend. When a king's body falters, those around him will do anything to pretend it does not. They will summon science, superstition, faith, and ritual, binding them together like desperate threads in a tapestry that is always unraveling. And so it was at Versailles, where Louis XIV's body became a living altar, examined by physicians, prayed over by priests, whispered about by courtiers, and mirrored by servants who had no choice but to believe that every wince, every grimace, every missed bite at the banquet carried the weight of prophecy. The indulgence that had rotted his teeth, clogged his stomach, and stiffened his joints now became the center of a strange dance between medicine and myth, each one trying to claim mastery over a man who had mastered everything but his own flesh. When his jaw swelled and his teeth broke, the doctors declared that excess sugar had disturbed the humors, that the balance of the body had been tilted by sweetness that had turned sour within. They spoke in words meant to sound like knowledge, prescribing bleedings and purges, leeches to drain the heat, enemas to wash away the corruption. Yet in truth, they were grasping in the dark, using rituals more than remedies, as if by sheer repetition they could convince the Sun King's body to obey. And the king endured it all, not because he believed in the science, but because belief itself was power. If the doctors worked upon him, then France could believe he was eternal. If the priests prayed over him, then France could believe God himself sanctified the Sunday junk food had broken his body, but ritual rebuilt the illusion. You must imagine the strangeness of those chambers. On one side, physicians armed with scalpels, syringes, jars of powders and syrups, each claiming to hold the secret to restoring the king's strength. On the other, priests raising crucifixes, sprinkling holy water, whispering prayers into the heavy air. And in the middle, Louis himself, draped in silk, his face pale, his mouth aching, his stomach twisted, yet refusing to show despair. For him, every moment of treatment was another performance, another way to display control. To cry out under the surgeon's knife would have been to admit weakness, so he clenched his fists and endured. To refuse food would have been to betray the image of abundance, so he chewed as best he could, his gums bleeding, his throat tight, his eyes watering with pain. And the court, always watching, always whispering, turned these sufferings into omens. If the king accepted a sugared almond after surgery, it meant hope. If he pushed the plate away, it meant dread. If he sipped chocolate thickened with sugar, the courtiers smiled. If he let the cup cool untouched, they trembled. Junk food had become part of prophecy, a sweetened language through which they tried to interpret the future. And so, Even as it ruined him, it became indispensable. No one dared imagine a world where the sun might set. Superstition thickened the air. Whispers spread that perhaps certain foods carried divine blessing, that candied fruits might preserve vitality, that chocolate, exotic and mysterious, might hold within it the fire of life. Some courtiers slipped into the king's ear tales of miraculous springs, healing waters that could cleanse the humors, herbs blessed by monks that could soothe the stomach, charms to wear beneath his robes to ward off pain. Louis listened, sometimes amused, sometimes desperate, for even a sun king was human enough to wish for relief. And when remedies failed, as they so often did, there was always prayer, always ritual, always another spectacle to reassure the watching world that France's center was not collapsing. Consider how his indulgence twisted itself into religion. To eat in public became a kind of liturgy. The courtiers watched with the reverence of worshippers, the king's hand raising food to his lips, like a priest raising the host at Mass. And just as the Eucharist promised transformation, so too did the Sun King's meal promise continuity, stability, the assurance that France was still whole. Junk food, absurd as it sounds, became sacrament at Versailles. Sugared almonds as holy as bread, wine as sacred as blood. To deny himself these indulgences would have been to shatter the illusion. And so, despite his pain, despite his decay, Louis ate. Religion did not only sanctify his eating, it sanctified his suffering. Priests reminded the court that kings, like Christ, must bear pain for the salvation of their people. Every tooth pulled, every ulcer bandaged, every groan at night was recast as noble sacrifice. The king's body became a relic in motion, his wounds proof of divine endurance, his endurance proof of divine favor. And the junk food that had caused so much of his agony was not denounced, but folded into the story. His sweetness, his indulgence, was reimagined as generosity, as if by consuming for himself, he consumed also for France, carrying the burden of excess so that others might believe in the glory of abundance. And yet, beneath the incense and the prayers, beneath the physician's jargon and the court's whispers, the truth remained the same. He was a man undone by indulgence, trapped in a palace that demanded he never stop performing. Imagine lying in his bedchamber at night, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the smell of poultices, the faint light of candles flickering against walls heavy with gold. Outside, the garden slept, fountains stilled, but inside, the king turned restlessly, his stomach cramped, his jaw throbbing, his body heavy with sugar's revenge. He could not escape it. Even in solitude, indulgence haunted him. And the court did not allow solitude for long. Servants moved in and out, doctors returned with new syrups, priests came with prayers, courtiers pressed for audiences, each one seeking to draw meaning from his suffering. The king was never alone, even in his pain. His body was never his own, it belonged to France, to the ritual of monarchy, to the illusion of eternity. Junk food had woven itself so deeply into his identity that even agony could not untangle it. He was both victim and participant, devourer and devoured, forever circling the sweet poison that sustained his image and destroyed his flesh. Perhaps you can feel the quiet lesson in this, as you listen, as your breath grows slower, as sleep draws near, that even the greatest power cannot silence the body's rebellion, that even the most sacred ritual cannot erase decay, that indulgence always carries its price. Louis XIV, radiant Sun King, master of Versailles, eater of endless sweets, suffered because he could not step away from the stage. His junk food was not merely food, it was prophecy, religion, performance. And in the end, it was his crown of thorns, invisible but unrelenting, carried each day as he walked the mirrored halls of his own creation. If Louis XIV devoured sweets as though each sugared almond confirmed his divinity, then the court that revolved around him devoured even more, not out of hunger, but out of fear, vanity, and imitation. Versailles was never merely a palace. It was a theater in which everyone played their part, and the part of the courtier was to mirror the king so perfectly that their reflection seemed indistinguishable from his light. And so, when the king indulged, they indulged. When he reached for candied chestnuts, they too filled their pockets. When he drank thickened chocolate, they demanded cup after cup, even if their stomachs rebelled. To live at Versailles was to live inside a hunger that was never your own, a hunger borrowed from the monarch, a craving staged for survival. Junk food here was not about pleasure. It was about proving loyalty, proving proximity to power, proving that you were worthy to orbit the Sunday. Imagine entering the Hall of Mirrors during a banquet. The chandeliers drip with light. The mirrored walls multiply the glow until it feels as if you are standing inside an eternal flame. At the far end, Louis presides. Each gesture deliberate, each mouthful a performance. Around him sit and stand the courtiers, powdered and perfumed, their wigs towering, their smiles fixed. The tables bend beneath dishes glazed with sugar, pastries glistening with syrup, meats cloaked in sauces so heavy they seem to slide like molten wax. And the courtiers, eager to be seen, eager to be noticed, eat with theatrical delight, chewing as though the sweetness itself were a prayer, laughing too loudly as though wine could erase the constant edge of anxiety. They are not eating for themselves, they are eating for him, for the spectacle, for survival. What was once the king's indulgence became the court's contagion. Soon, it was not enough to eat. One had to be seen eating. One had to be seen enjoying. One had to be seen craving. And so they competed in absurd ways. Who could praise the sugared fruits more poetically? Who could design a dessert more elaborate? Who could flatter the cooks until a dish bore their name? In this frenzy, junk food became fashion. Sweets were not simply consumed. They were displayed on handkerchiefs, tucked into gloves, carried away as tokens. Candied violets, crystallized roses, almond pastes, shaped like miniature sculptures, all of these were passed around like jewelry. Edible jewels meant to be admired as much as eaten, and the courtiers paid a price. Their teeth too began to rot. Their bodies too began to swell. But vanity demanded they disguise it with powders, perfumes, stiff corsets that reshaped their swelling into a silhouette of elegance. They smiled through the pain of cavities. They danced through the weight of indulgence. They laughed while their stomachs churned. Versailles demanded it. To step away, to refuse, to crave less, was to risk invisibility. And invisibility at court was a slow death. Better to rot in sugar than to be forgotten. Outside the palace walls, the contrast was stark. In the countryside, peasants dug for roots, boiled weeds, chewed on hard crusts of bread that could barely soften in water. Famine struck with terrifying regularity. Children starved, mothers wept over empty pots. And yet within Versailles, sugar flowed like water. Meats roasted in endless rotation. Pastries rose in oven after oven. The peasants paid in taxes, so that courtiers could crumble candied chestnuts between their fingers. Junk food at court was built upon the hunger of a nation. And the courtiers, though they might have known, did not allow themselves to see it, because to acknowledge it would have been to break the illusion, and at Versailles, illusions were stronger than truth. There were courtiers who tried to turn indulgence into art. They commissioned new confections, experimenting with exotic ingredients brought from colonies, vanilla from the New World, cinnamon from the East, chocolate from across the ocean. To present a new flavor to the king was to gamble for favor, to risk fortune for a chance at a nod of approval. A successful sweet might elevate a family for a season. A failed dish might condemn them to ridicule. And so kitchens became laboratories of sugar, courtiers became critics of candied invention, and the palace became a theater of endless tasting. Junk food was no longer only indulgence. It was currency, a coin minted in sugar, traded in glances, measured in crumbs. Yet behind the glitter, there was unease. Some whispered that such excess was unnatural, that too much sugar weakened the body, that too much wine dulled the mind, that too much indulgence corroded not only teeth but souls. Priests warned in hushed tones that gluttony was a sin, though their voices were drowned by laughter and music. And the courtiers themselves, when they returned to their chambers, sometimes doubled over in pain, their stomachs twisted, their mouths aching, but they returned to the table the next day, painted smiles covering agony, because the show could not end. Versailles demanded endless repetition, and junk food was its most visible prop. Picture the gardens outside, perfectly ordered, symmetrical, designed to display control over nature itself. Inside, the bodies of courtiers rebelled against that order, swollen, aching, rotting, but forced into corsets, powdered into masks, disciplined into silence. It was as though Versailles itself was a great confection, a sugar sculpture that gleamed brilliantly from afar but crumbled if touched. The Sun King's light blinded them, but in the shadows of their own rooms, they too paid the price of indulgence. And still, they called it pleasure. They convinced themselves that the sweetness was worth the pain, that the spectacle was worth the decay, that to eat like the king was to taste eternity. But eternity was a lie, and their bodies knew it, whispering rebellion in every cavity, every cramp, every restless night. Junk food was never just food here. It was ritual, imitation, sacrifice. The courtiers sacrificed health for presence, presence for favor, favor for survival. Perhaps you can feel, even now, how eerily familiar it all. Island. We too live in a world where people eat not for hunger, but for image, where indulgence is posted, shared, admired, where bodies ache in silence while smiles flash for the camera. Versailles was only the first great stage for this drama, a palace where junk food became not only pleasure but prophecy, not only indulgence but identity. And so, as you listen, as your breath grows softer, as the night deepens, imagine the mirrored halls filled with laughter that rings too loudly, tables bending beneath towers of pastries, courtiers chewing with forced delight, their eyes darting always toward the king, waiting for his next bite. Imagine them stuffing sweetness into their mouths, as though their lives depended on it because, in truth, they did. This was the court of Louis XIV, where junk food became contagion, where indulgence became law, where the Sun King's craving burned into the very flesh of those who circled him. Beyond the glittering mirrors of Versailles, beyond the gardens that stretched like illusions carved from earth and stone, there lay another France, a France not gilded but gray, not perfumed, but sharp with the smell of hunger and toil. While the king and his court devoured candied chestnuts and pastries glazed with sugar, peasants in the countryside chewed on crusts so hard they bloodied their gums, boiled weeds into thin soups, and prayed for harvests that the weather too often betrayed. And yet, in a strange, almost cruel symmetry, the cravings of Versailles shaped even the lives of these peasants, for it was their hands that harvested the sugarcane in distant colonies, their backs that bent in the fields to grow wheat taxed into oblivion, their coins scraped away to fund the spectacles that fed the king's table. Junk food at Versailles was not isolated. It spread outward like ripples on water, each circle touching lives that would never see the chandeliers, never walk the mirrored halls, but felt their weight all the same. Imagine a farmer in the provinces, his face weathered, his hands calloused, standing at a wooden table where bread should sit thick and warm. Instead, there is only a thin loaf, stretched too far, taxed too heavily. He has heard rumors, carried by travelers or soldiers, that the king eats sugar sculpted into swans, that chocolate flows like rivers, that banquets last until dawn. To him, these rumors feel like tales of another world, yet they are true, and their truth gnaws at him as much as hunger does. For every sweet Louis tasted, some invisible tax had been paid by men like him. The king's junk food was built on the absence of the peasant's bread. Merchants in Paris, too, felt the pull of the Sun King's appetite. They supplied candied fruits, imported spices, barrels of wine, and they grew wealthy in the shadow of Versailles, feeding the court's endless cravings. Yet even among them, there was unease. They watched as prices rose, as the hunger of the palace distorted markets, as sugar that might have been rare indulgence became constant necessity for the nobility, while ordinary families saw even onions and rye grow scarce. The glitter of Versailles distorted the rhythm of the entire kingdom, drawing resources inward like a star collapsing into itself. Junk food was not simply a royal indulgence. It was an economic gravity, bending the lives of millions toward the banquet table of one man. And still, the illusion had power. Ordinary people, though they grumbled, still marveled at stories of Versailles. They imagined the sugar towers, the endless pastries, the wine flowing in crystal goblets, and some part of them, even in hunger, believed it meant France was strong, that their king was eternal. It was as though they had been bewitched, convinced that his indulgence somehow protected them, that his excess was their shield. Yet cracks appeared, and in those cracks, resentment seeped like slow water. When famine struck, when harvests failed, when children died with bellies swollen from hunger, the image of candied swans at Versailles became unbearable. Whispers spread, How could one man feast while so many starved? The junk food that once dazzled now became a symbol of betrayal. Sweetness turned bitter in the mouths of those who could not taste it. Even the clergy, caught between palace and parish, wrestled with this contradiction. At Versailles, priests blessed the king's meals as sacraments, praising his abundance as a reflection of divine favor. But in villages, parish priests looked into the hollow eyes of their flock, listened to their confessions of stealing bread or eating grass, and wondered how to reconcile such suffering with tales of sugared almonds and fountains of chocolate. The contradiction grew sharper each year, until even the language of God seemed strained beneath it. Junk food had become more than indulgence, it had become accusation, a visible reminder that power consumed while others wasted away. And yet, there was fascination too. When noblemen returned from Versailles to their estates, they brought with them not only gossip but recipes, confections, cravings. Soon, the taste for junk food spread among provincial elites. Pastry shops appeared in Paris, selling miniature versions of the court's indulgences. Wealthy families demanded sugar sculptures at weddings, candied violets at christenings, chocolate at funerals. The court's cravings infected the nation, not equally, not fairly, but persistently. And so the spectacle of Versailles seeped into society, until junk food was not merely royal, it was French, a symbol of identity as much as indulgence. But identity built upon excess cannot endure without strain. As wars drained the treasury, as taxes grew heavier, as hunger pressed more cruelly upon the poor, the sight of nobles licking sugar from their fingers became less charming, more enraging. Stories spread of courtiers fainting from overindulgence, of nobles collapsing in feasts, while peasants collapsed in fields. These stories, whether exaggerated or not, carried the power of metaphor. They revealed a kingdom where one part devoured and the other starved, where junk food was both pleasure and poison, sweetness and sickness, indulgence and injustice. Do you feel the tension building, even now, centuries later? The sweetness of Versailles cannot be remembered without the bitterness of its cost. Every sugared almond eaten beneath the chandeliers carried with it the weight of a field untended, a family unfed, a tax collected by force. The illusion of abundance was paid for by the reality of hunger. And though for a time the illusion held, illusions cannot last forever. And yet, let us not rush. Let us stay for a moment in that strange in-between, where fascination and resentment lived side by side. Imagine a young peasant woman traveling to Paris, catching sight of a pastry shop window for the first time. She stares at cakes glazed with sugar, fruits candied into jewels, chocolate poured into delicate cups. For a moment, she is dazzled, as though she has glimpsed Versailles itself. For a moment, she forgets her hunger and feels only wonder. That is the power indulgence holds, the power Louis understood instinctively. That sweetness blinds, that junk food, even when it poisons, first enchants. And France, for decades, remained under that enchantment, dazzled by sugar even as it starved. But enchantments, too, decay. As the king aged, as his body weakened, as wars dragged on and coffers emptied, the enchantment faltered. The people began to see the illusion for what it was, not eternal glory, but fragile indulgence. Junk food no longer looked like abundance, it looked like corruption. And in that shift, the seeds of future storms were planted, storms that would one day sweep away not only the candied swans but the very throne they symbolized. For now, though, in this chapter of the story, the illusion still holds, even if it trembles. Versailles still glitters, sugar still flows, peasants still bow, merchants still profit, priests still bless, courtiers still chew and swallow, as though their lives depend on it. But in the silence of the fields, in the whispers of markets, in the prayers of starving families, a different rhythm beats, a rhythm that will not stay silent forever. And so, as you drift deeper into this story, deeper into the quiet of the night, imagine France itself caught between sweetness and hunger, between spectacle and survival, between illusion and truth. That was the world Louis XIV created. A world where junk food was not just an indulgence, but a symbol that dazzled and betrayed in equal measure. By the time Louis XIV reached the final chapters of his long reign, The sun had begun to set even as he insisted it still shone. He had lived longer than most men dared to imagine, outlasting rivals, ministers, mistresses, even his own children, yet time exacted its price. His body, already scarred by decades of indulgence, decayed further with each year, and the banquets that once proclaimed vitality became fragile performances, shadows of their former brilliance. Imagine the king, now aged, his back heavy with pain, his face lined not only by years but by suffering, his mouth nearly toothless, yet still seated at the head of endless tables, still expected to chew, to smile, to sip, to show that the sun never faltered. Versailles had been built upon illusion, and illusion demanded endurance. Junk food had fueled his rise, but now it mocked him, each sugared fruit a reminder of what it had taken away. The man who had once devoured mountains of roasted meats and candied chestnuts could now hardly manage broth, his gums bleeding, his jaw aching, his stomach rebelling. And yet the banquets continued, for to cancel them would be to admit weakness, and weakness was unthinkable. So the table was set as always, pastries sculpted like towers, fruits glazed to gleam like jewels, wines poured until goblets overflowed. Courtiers watched as he lifted a spoon, as he tasted a drop of broth sweetened to hide bitterness, as he forced himself to chew even when his mouth throbbed. They clapped politely, they whispered approval, and they pretended not to notice how the Sun King's hand trembled, how his eyes watered, how his lips winced as the sweetness stung his ruined teeth. It was a ritual of denial, and everyone played their part. Do you see the quiet cruelty of it? The king, once master of all, now enslaved to a performance he could not escape. He ate because he must be seen to eat, drank because he must be seen to drink, indulged because indulgence itself had become the foundation of his throne. His courtiers, bound by their own survival, applauded what they knew was agony, pretending that the sun remained unbroken, though in private they whispered, as courtiers always do, that the sun was fading. And yet Louis himself refused surrender. If his body weakened, his will only hardened. He endured surgeries without complaint, allowed physicians to cut, to prod, to bleed, to burn, his jaw swollen, his belly twisted, his limbs heavy with gout. He endured because endurance itself had become his identity. He was the sun, and the sun did not set in public. Even as he limped through the mirrored halls, even as he winced behind his fan, he carried himself with the weight of eternity. Junk food had broken him, yes, but it had also taught him this lesson, that illusion is stronger than truth, that if he continued the performance, France would believe it, and belief was power. But in the solitude of night, when the chandeliers were dark and the courtiers slept, the truth pressed closer. Imagine the king in his vast bed, curtains drawn, air thick with the smell of poultices, the distant murmur of fountains faint through the glass. His stomach cramped, his jaw throbbed, his body begged for rest, yet sleep eluded him. Memories of banquets flickered in his mind, sugar towers gleaming, courtiers laughing, the taste of chocolate sweet and thick, and each memory was tinged with bitterness. He had consumed, endlessly consumed, and now consumption consumed him. He was a man devoured by his own indulgence, and in those hours, when no one watched, he must have known it. The courtiers, too, saw the shadow creeping in, though they never admitted it aloud. They watched as his appetite waned, as he left sweets untouched, as he lingered longer over a single sip. They disguised their dread in compliments, praising his endurance, inventing stories of his vigor, but the truth lay visible in every step, every grimace. And outside Versailles, the people of France whispered differently. To them, the image of a king feasting while they starved was already bitter enough. Now, to hear that he suffered, that his body rotted, that the sun was dimming, was both comfort and curse. Some pitied him, others rejoiced quietly, for his decline mirrored their own anger. Junk food had once dazzled them from afar, but now it symbolized only the excess that drained their lives. In his later years, even the priests altered their tone. Where once they sanctified his indulgence, now they sanctified his suffering, casting his pain as noble sacrifice, his decay as holy endurance. They compared him to martyrs, to Christ himself, insisting that his wounds were borne for the glory of France. And Louis accepted this, perhaps because it gave meaning to agony, perhaps because it disguised what could not be denied. His banquets became less about food and more about ritual, his sweetness less about pleasure and more about memory. Echoes of a life lived too richly, too indulgently, now collapsing under its own weight. And yet, even then, the spectacle never ceased. The kitchens still labored, fires still burned, sugar still melted into sculptures, ovens still exhaled pastries into air already thick with grease and smoke. Servants carried trays heavy with food the king could no longer eat. Courtiers praised dishes he barely touched, and the illusion of abundance carried on. Versailles itself had become addicted to indulgence, unable to stop, even when the king's body rejected it. Junk food was not just his downfall, it was the palace's obsession, the court's lifeblood, the nation's contradiction. There is something deeply human in this, isn't there? The way we cling to rituals even when they no longer serve us. The way we repeat indulgence even as it harms us. The way illusion can seem more necessary than truth. Louis XIV, in his later years, embodied this paradox. He was a man both worshipped and broken, both eternal and fragile, both sun and shadow. His junk food, once pleasure, had become torment, yet still it circled him, still it defined him, still it whispered of power, even as it consumed him. So imagine him, in those final decades, seated at his table beneath chandeliers that flickered like fading stars. His courtiers laugh, their teeth rotting too, their stomachs aching, their wigs powdered, their perfumes masking decay. Servants carry sugared fruits he cannot bite, pastries he cannot swallow, wines he can only sip. The king forces a smile, raises his cup, chews slowly, painfully, but publicly. The court applauds. The illusion holds. Outside, peasants starve. Inside, courtiers feast. And at the center of it all, the Sun King endures. A man broken by indulgence, yet still bound to it. A man whose body has become the truest stage of all. By the time the final curtain drew near, Louis XIV was no longer the radiant Sun King, whose youth had dazzled Europe with endless dances, banquets, and towering sugar sculptures. He was an old man now, his body withered, his mouth a ruin of missing teeth, his legs swollen with gout, his breath heavy with the stench of rot. And yet the rituals of Versailles did not fade. Even as he approached death, the table was laid, the dishes prepared, the illusion repeated again and again, as though sugar and spectacle could hold back the tide of mortality. Imagine him, my friend, in those dimming years, seated beneath chandeliers whose light no longer softened his face, surrounded by courtiers too afraid to admit what they saw, forcing himself to lift a spoon, to sip a broth, to swallow a sweetened bite, his eyes watering with pain. Food, once his delight, once his weapon of power, now became his torment. And yet he clung to it still, because it was more than nourishment, it was the symbol of who he was. Each banquet of those years was a shadow play. Courtiers praised dishes he could not chew, laughed at wines he could not finish, whispered admiration at sweets he pushed aside. The kitchens still roared with fires, sugar still melted into sculptures, meat still roasted until fat dripped into flames, but the king could no longer share in their excess. His doctors, who had once prescribed purges and bleedings, now advised softer fare, broths, porridges, chocolate thinned with water, fruits stewed until they collapsed into mush. And still, even these small indulgences pained him, his stomach rebelling, his gums bleeding, his body weary of sweetness. Yet the ritual continued, for Versailles itself could not imagine silence at the table. In those moments, food became memory as much as taste. Louis would look at a sugared chestnut and remember his youth, when he bit into it with strong teeth, when courtiers gasped in admiration at his appetite. He would see a goblet of wine and recall nights of laughter, when he drank deeply and danced until dawn. He would watch as sugar towers collapsed and remember how once they symbolized his eternal reign. Now, each sweet was a ghost, each dish a reminder of time's cruelty. The indulgence that had crowned him now mocked him, whispering that even kings cannot escape decay. And yet, he did not stop the performance. To the very end, he understood that monarchy lived in ritual, not in flesh. If he stopped eating in public, if he admitted defeat, then the illusion would falter, and France itself would tremble. So he endured, grimacing in silence, forcing spoonfuls into his mouth, nodding as though he still delighted in flavors he could barely sense. The courtiers applauded, the priests blessed, the servants carried trays, as though nothing had changed, but everyone knew. They knew that the sun was setting, that sweetness had turned bitter, that the king was no longer devouring life, but being devoured by it. Outside Versailles, famine struck again and again. People rioted for bread, mothers wept over empty pots, children wasted away. News of the king's suffering reached them too, carried by gossip, twisted into stories that spread like wildfire. Some pitied him, imagining the great monarch tormented by the very indulgence that had defined him. Others took satisfaction, seeing his decay as justice, as proof that no man, however powerful, could escape the consequences of excess. The Sun King's junk food had become a parable, told in whispers by peasants as they chewed on hard crusts. See how sweetness destroys. See how even kings are punished for gluttony. In his last months, Louis's illness worsened. His leg blackened with gangrene, the stench filling his chambers even as perfumes tried to disguise it. He could barely stand, barely move, barely speak without pain. His doctors, desperate, offered no cure, only rituals of bleeding, poultices, and prayers. And yet, the banquets did not stop. Dishes were still presented, though he could not taste them, as though food itself could ward off death. It was a grotesque theater, a dying king seated before towers of sugar he could not touch, courtiers applauding a performance no one believed, priests whispering prayers over a body already surrendering. Junk food had become nothing more than symbol, a ritual to distract from the truth that no feast could banish mortality. Imagine that chamber in his final days, curtains drawn to block the light, the air heavy with incense, the sound of fountains faint beyond the windows. The king lies in bed, his body wasting, his face pale, his breath shallow. Yet on a small table beside him sits a silver dish with candied fruits, untouched, their sweetness glistening uselessly. A servant refills a goblet of watered wine he will never drink. The ritual continues, even as the man himself fades. Food has become a ghost, a relic of who he once was, a reminder that indulgence cannot outlast time. And still, Louis clung to the performance. Even in pain, he allowed himself to be dressed in silks, to be seen by courtiers, to nod at dishes presented. He knew he was dying, and he spoke of it openly, telling his great-grandson, the boy who would inherit the throne, not to repeat his mistakes, not to love war, not to indulge too deeply. But those words, honest as they were, could not erase the image of a life built upon sugar, a reign defined by indulgence. The memory of candied swans and endless banquets would outlive his warnings. Junk food was the shadow that followed his legacy, as inescapable as the mirrored halls of Versailles. And so the Sun King died, not in the blaze of eternal youth he had promised, but in the quiet decay of a body undone by indulgence. The courtiers mourned, the priests prayed, the people whispered. Some said his death was noble, that he had endured with dignity. Others said it was fitting, that the man who had devoured so much had been devoured in turn. Either way, the symbolism was inescapable. Louis XIV's junk food was not just his weakness, it was the monarchy's weakness, sweetness hiding rot, spectacle disguising decline. As you lie in the stillness of this night, think of him in those last hours. The king who had been the sun, now a frail man in a bed that smelled of decay, surrounded by sweets he could not taste, applauded for a performance he could no longer sustain. Think of the irony, the lesson, the quiet truth, that even the greatest illusion cannot outlast the body, that even the sweetest indulgence carries bitterness, that even kings cannot eat their way out of death. And in that thought, perhaps, you will feel the calm rhythm of history, steady and unrelenting, carrying you gently towards sleep. By the time the final curtain drew near, Louis XIV was no longer the radiant Sun King, whose youth had dazzled Europe with endless dances, banquets, and towering sugar sculptures. He was an old man now, his body withered, his mouth a ruin of missing teeth, his legs swollen with gout, his breath heavy with the stench of rot. And yet the rituals of Versailles did not fade. Even as he approached death, the table was laid, the dishes prepared, the illusion repeated again and again, as though sugar and spectacle could hold back the tide of mortality. Imagine him, my friend, in those dimming years, seated beneath chandeliers whose light no longer softened his face, surrounded by courtiers too afraid to admit what they saw, forcing himself to lift a spoon, to sip a broth, to swallow a sweetened bite, his eyes watering with pain. Food, once his delight, once his weapon of power, now became his torment. And yet he clung to it still, because it was more than nourishment, it was the symbol of who he was. Each banquet of those years was a shadow play. Courtiers praised dishes he could not chew, laughed at wines he could not finish, whispered admiration at sweets he pushed aside. The kitchen still roared with fires, sugar still melted into sculptures, meat still roasted until fat dripped into flames, but the king could no longer share in their excess. His doctors, who had once prescribed purges and bleedings, now advised softer fare: broths, porridges, chocolate thinned with water, fruits stewed until they collapsed into mush. And still, even these small indulgences pained him, his stomach rebelling, his gums bleeding, his body weary of sweetness. Yet the ritual continued, for Versailles itself could not imagine silence at the table. In those moments, food became memory as much as taste. Louis would look at a sugared chestnut and remember his youth, when he bit into it with strong teeth, when courtiers gasped in admiration at his appetite. He would see a goblet of wine and recall nights of laughter, when he drank deeply and danced until dawn. He would watch as sugar towers collapsed and remember how once they symbolized his eternal reign. Now, each sweet was a ghost, each dish a reminder of time's cruelty. The indulgence that had crowned him now mocked him, whispering that even kings cannot escape decay. And yet, he did not stop the performance. To the very end, he understood that monarchy lived in ritual, not in flesh. If he stopped eating in public, if he admitted defeat, then the illusion would falter, and France itself would tremble. So he endured, grimacing in silence, forcing spoonfuls into his mouth, nodding as though he still delighted in flavors he could barely sense. The courtiers applauded, the priests blessed, the servants carried trays, as though nothing had changed. But everyone knew. They knew that the sun was setting, that sweetness had turned bitter, that the king was no longer devouring life, but being devoured by it. Outside Versailles, famine struck again and again. People rioted for bread, mothers wept over empty pots, children wasted away. News of the king's suffering reached them too, carried by gossip, twisted into stories that spread like wildfire. Some pitied him, imagining the great monarch tormented by the very indulgence that had defined him. Others took satisfaction, seeing his decay as justice, as proof that no man, however powerful, could escape the consequences of excess. The Sun King's junk food had become a parable, told in whispers by peasants as they chewed on hard crusts. See how sweetness destroys. See how even kings are punished for gluttony. In his last months, Louis's illness worsened. His leg blackened with gangrene, the stench filling his chambers even as perfumes tried to disguise it. He could barely stand, barely move, barely speak without pain. His doctors, desperate, offered no cure, only rituals of bleeding, poultices, and prayers. And yet, the banquets did not stop. Dishes were still presented, though he could not taste them, as though food itself could ward off death. It was a grotesque theater, a dying king seated before towers of sugar he could not touch, courtiers applauding a performance no one believed, priests whispering prayers over a body already surrendering. Junk food had become nothing more than symbol, a ritual to distract from the truth that no feast could banish mortality. Imagine that chamber in his final days, curtains drawn to block the light, the air heavy with incense, the sound of fountains faint beyond the windows. The king lies in bed, his body wasting, his face pale, his breath shallow. Yet on a small table beside him sits a silver dish with candied fruits, untouched, their sweetness glistening uselessly. A servant refills a goblet of watered wine he will never drink. The ritual continues, even as the man himself fades. Food has become a ghost, a relic of who he once was, a reminder that indulgence cannot outlast time. And still, Louis clung to the performance. Even in pain, he allowed himself to be dressed in silks, to be seen by courtiers, to nod at dishes presented. He knew he was dying, and he spoke of it openly, telling his great-grandson, the boy who would inherit the throne, not to repeat his mistakes, not to love war, not to indulge too deeply. But those words, honest as they were, could not erase the image of a life built upon sugar, a reign defined by indulgence. The memory of candied swans and endless banquets would outlive his warnings. Junk food was the shadow that followed his legacy, as inescapable as the mirrored halls of Versailles. And so the Sun King died, not in the blaze of eternal youth he had promised, but in the quiet decay of a body undone by indulgence. The courtiers mourned, the priests prayed, the people whispered. Some said his death was noble, that he had endured with dignity. Others said it was fitting, that the man who had devoured so much had been devoured in turn. Either way, the symbolism was inescapable. Louis XIV's junk food was not just his weakness, it was the monarchy's weakness. Sweetness hiding rot, spectacle disguising decline. As you lie in the stillness of this night, think of him in those last hours. The king who had been the sun, now a frail man in a bed that smelled of decay, surrounded by sweets he could not taste, applauded for a performance he could no longer sustain. Think of the irony, the lesson, the quiet truth, that even the greatest illusion cannot outlast the body, that even the sweetest indulgence carries bitterness, that even kings cannot eat their way out of death. And in that thought, perhaps, you will feel the calm rhythm of history, steady and unrelenting, carrying you gently towards sleep. When Louis XIV finally slipped from the world, leaving Versailles hushed under drapes of mourning, the illusion of eternal sweetness shattered, and yet the taste of it lingered. For decades he had taught his court and his kingdom that abundance was the language of power, that sugar and spectacle could disguise rot, that indulgence itself was proof of divinity. But now the man was gone, and what remained were memories, stories, whispers that would travel far beyond his reign. Junk food had not only devoured his teeth and his stomach, it had devoured the image of the monarchy, leaving behind a symbol too sharp to ignore. The Sun King's legacy was written in sugar, and sugar, like power, melts when exposed to heat. In the days after his death, Versailles still performed its rituals. Banquets were prepared, though they felt emptier. The mirrors still multiplied the light, though without the king the reflections looked hollow. Courtiers gathered around the new boy king, Louis XV, but their laughter was more restrained, their smiles thinner. They remembered the old sun, the endless sweets, the grand banquets that had once seemed immortal, and they wondered if such indulgence could be repeated without him. For though the palace still glittered, the truth was unavoidable. The illusion had always been tied to one man, and one man only. Without him, sugar no longer dazzled the same way. Junk food without the sun was just food, and food without meaning was dangerous in a hungry kingdom. Beyond the palace, memory grew sharper. Farmers remembered their hunger while hearing stories of candied swans. Mothers remembered burying children while imagining goblets of wine spilled upon marble. Merchants remembered taxes that had emptied their purses while courtiers licked sugar from their fingers. The contrast between indulgence and hunger became more than gossip. It became grievance. And grievance, once planted, grows like weeds through stone. When famine struck again, people pointed not only to the skies but to Versailles, remembering the Sun King's banquets as proof that the monarchy cared nothing for their suffering. Junk food, once a symbol of abundance, became a symbol of betrayal. Even within the court, the memory of sweetness carried unease. Courtiers who had once praised sugar towers now whispered that perhaps they had gone too far, that perhaps indulgence had weakened not only the king's body but the body of the state itself. Doctors, who had prescribed endless purges and praised the king's endurance, admitted quietly that sugar had destroyed him. Priests, who had blessed his meals as sacraments, began to preach against gluttony once more. The very symbols that had elevated him became weapons against his memory. The sun had set, and with it, the sweetness curdled. But memory is never simple. For some, Louis XIV remained a figure of awe. They told stories of his grandeur, of Versailles glittering like heaven, of sugar flowing like rivers, of banquets that seemed eternal. They remembered him as more than a man. He was theater itself, an actor who never forgot his role, who endured pain with dignity, who refused to let the illusion die. For these admirers, even his junk food indulgence was reframed as generosity, as if by eating for himself he had eaten for all of France, carrying the burden of sweetness so others could bask in reflected light. Memory, like sugar, can be reshaped, melted, poured into molds, and so even his flaws became part of a myth that some chose to preserve. Yet the myth could not silence reality. As the 18th century unfolded, as new kings reigned and new famines struck, the contrast between Versailles' sweetness and France's hunger grew unbearable. By the time revolution stirred, the image of Louis XIV feasting while peasants starved had hardened into symbol. Retold as evidence of monarchy's corruption, it no longer mattered that he had suffered, that he had endured surgeries and pain, that sweets had mocked him in his final years. What mattered was the memory of sugar, sugar towers, sugar sculptures, sugar excess. Junk food became shorthand for everything wrong with monarchy: decadence, selfishness, blindness to suffering. The revolutionaries, when they stormed Versailles decades later, were not only toppling a palace, they were toppling an illusion fed by sugar. Think of how strange it is, how food lingers in memory longer than treaties, longer than battles, longer than proclamations. Louis XIV fought wars, built armies, signed treaties, commanded Europe. But what people remembered, what haunted them, were the banquets, the sweets, the junk food that symbolized power devouring itself. History has a way of distilling itself into symbols. And for Louis, the candied chestnut was as powerful as the crown, the sugared swan as memorable as the sword. His body, broken by indulgence, became the monarchy's body. His craving, mirrored by his courtiers, became the kingdom's craving. His decay, hidden behind chandeliers, became the monarchy's decay, hidden behind gold. And so, even centuries later, when people walk through Versailles today, what they imagine are not only the mirrors and fountains but the feasts. They picture sugar towers collapsing, wine spilling, pastries crumbling under their own sweetness. They picture courtiers laughing too loudly, their teeth rotting, their wigs powdered, their stomachs swollen. They picture the king himself, smiling through pain, forcing sweetness past ruined teeth, pretending he was eternal. Versailles has many rooms, many corridors, but the most haunting are the imagined dining halls, where indulgence became ritual, and ritual became symbol, and symbol became memory. Junk food remains in the air like a ghost, invisible but undeniable. And what does this memory whisper to us now, lying here in quiet centuries later? It tells us that indulgence dazzles but destroys, that sweetness can disguise rot but cannot cure it, that spectacle can hold belief for a time but never forever. It tells us that power built on sugar is fragile, that illusions built on junk food collapse when hunger presses too sharply. It tells us that even the sun cannot eat its way out of mortality. And perhaps, most hauntingly, it tells us that our own age is not so different. For don't we too chase sweetness that corrodes us? Don't we too believe in illusions of abundance? Don't we too consume endlessly while ignoring the hunger just beyond our sight? Versailles is not gone, it echoes still, reflected in neon lights, in supermarket aisles, in the way junk food remains both temptation and symbol in our own time. So, as you rest now, as your breathing slows, imagine the end of that long reign. The palace still glittering, the tables still groaning, the sweets still shimmering under candlelight, but the man who made them symbols gone. His body returned to dust. His legacy lingering like a taste too sweet, too bitter, too unforgettable. The Sun King is no more, but his junk food lives on, not in flavor, but in memory, in symbol, in warning. Sweetness that dazzles, indulgence that consumes, illusion that collapses. This is what remains, carried across centuries like a whisper in the night. And so, my friend, as we arrive at the quiet end of this long journey, the candles flickering low, the mirrored halls of Versailles emptying into silence, it is time to let the story settle, not as noise, but as a kind of echo that lingers gently in the mind. You have walked with me through the sweetness and the rot, through the banquets and the famine, through the laughter of courtiers and the groans of a king undone by indulgence, and now all that remains is reflection, soft and steady, like the rhythm of waves against a shore at night. Louis XIV, the Sun King, built a world upon sugar, upon spectacle, upon the ritual of junk food that dazzled and betrayed. And when he died, he left behind not only palaces and wars, but a memory so strange and sharp, it still glimmers across centuries. The image of a man who tried to eat eternity, who devoured sweetness as though it could keep the sun from setting, and who discovered, as we all must, that sweetness cannot outlast time. Picture him one last time, if you will, not as the radiant youth dancing in halls gilded with gold, not as the middle-aged monarch gnawing through candied fruits with rotting teeth, not as the old man grimacing as broth burned his stomach, but simply as a figure fading into memory, a man whose life was both feast and famine, indulgence and decay, illusion and truth. The junk food of his reign was never only food, it was metaphor, symbol, warning. It told his courtiers who they were, it told his people what they lacked, it told history what it would remember, and it tells us still, here in this quiet moment, that indulgence carries its own reckoning, that illusions, however dazzling, cannot prevent decay, that sweetness hides bitterness but never destroys it. Do you feel the stillness now? The way the story slows, like a candle burning low, like footsteps softening as they leave a long corridor? History, when told this way, is not a clamor of battles or treaties but a lullaby of rhythms, the small repetitions of life that remind us we are all human. Louis XIV was a king, yes, but he was also a man who craved sweets, who rotted from them, who clung to them as symbols, who was betrayed by them as surely as he was betrayed by time. His story is not only about him, it is about us, about the way we, too, chase illusions, the way we, too, devour what does not sustain us, the way we, too, dress decay in sugar, so that we may pretend it is beautiful. Versailles is not gone. It lives in every supermarket aisle, in every neon sign promising sweetness, in every advertisement that disguises rot with shine. The king's banquets echo in our own cravings. His illusions mirror our own. But let us not end in bitterness. Let us linger instead in the softness of understanding. For Louis XIV, despite his flaws, despite his indulgence, despite the cruelty of hunger outside his palace walls, was also a man who understood theater, who understood the necessity of performance, who carried the weight of illusion not only for himself, but for an entire kingdom. He did not collapse the ritual even when his body demanded rest. He endured, because endurance was the last role he could play. And in that endurance there is, strangely, a kind of dignity, even nobility. He became the very thing he performed, a man who refused to let the sun set until it set completely. And perhaps that is why we remember him not only with scorn but with awe. So as you lie here, listening, perhaps with your eyes half closed, perhaps already drifting into dreams, let yourself imagine the echoes of that palace fading away. The sugar towers have melted, the pastries have crumbled, the wine has spilled, the courtiers are gone. Only silence remains, and in that silence, a kind of peace. The story of the Sun King is not a tale to frighten, but a tale to soothe, a tale that reminds us that even the grandest illusions end in quiet, that even the sweetest cravings dissolve, that even kings must surrender to the same rhythm of time that carries you now toward sleep. And maybe, as you rest, you will carry a question with you, not sharp, not urgent, but gentle, like a leaf floating on water. What illusions do you cling to? What sweetness do you chase? What junk food of the soul do you consume even when it betrays you? And perhaps you will smile at the thought, because to be human is to crave, to indulge, to pretend, to endure. We are all, in our own way, reflections of Versailles, chasing sugar that cannot last, and yet finding beauty in the chase itself. When the revolution came, decades after Louis XIV was gone, the people stormed palaces, tore down symbols, demanded bread instead of sugar, truth instead of illusion. But by then, the memory of the Sun King's indulgence had already done its work. It had shown the world the fragility of power built on spectacle, the danger of sweetness without sustenance, the inevitability of collapse when illusion becomes heavier than truth. And yet, even in that collapse, something beautiful remains. The stories, the symbols, the lessons carried across centuries, whispered now in your ear as you drift into night. So let this story be not only about Louis XIV, but about you, about us, about the rhythm of humanity that never changes. Let it be a lullaby that soothes even as it reveals, a reminder that history is not only battles and kings, but also the quiet truth of cravings, the small details of life that outlive empires. Sugar melts, illusions fade, the sun sets, and still we remember. That is the rhythm of history, steady, soft, eternal. And now, As the final words settle, I will leave you with quiet questions, not for answers, but for dreams. What sweetness in your own life disguises bitterness? What illusions do you polish until they gleam? What cravings do you follow even when they betray you? And more gently still, what truths wait for you beneath the sugar? Truths that will not harm but will set you free. Let those questions drift with you, soft as a blanket, steady as breath, into the darkness where sleep waits. Thank you, my friend, for staying with me through this journey, for walking the mirrored halls of history, for sitting at the table of kings, for tasting both sweetness and rot. If you have closed your eyes already, let them stay closed. Let the rhythm of this voice carry you further, deeper, until the world grows quiet. And if you are still awake, know that tomorrow, another story will be waiting, another journey through the shadows and lights of the past, another chance to listen, to wonder, to rest. For now, though, let this story end here, like a candle snuffed softly, like the echo of a bell fading into silence, like the sun itself, setting not in fury but in calm. Sleep well, my friend. Return tomorrow, and we will wander again. Goodbye.